So now, as a class, we're going to be going over the when of the classical era. The classical era lasted from 1730 to 1820. The classical period in music fell in between the Baroque era and the Romantic era. So this is after the Baroque era and before the Romantic era. In the middle of the 18th century, Europe began to move towards new styles of architecture, literature, and art. So we began to see like a sort of renaissance in between these two time periods. We started to see differences in between how we used to build buildings, how we used to read and write, and also how art was produced, such as paintings or let that be music. As the 18th century progressed, instrumental music began to take the front stage of music rather than vocal music that had been in the front before. So during this time period, we began to see a lot of instruments being used compared to voices that we have seen before, like in the Baroque and the medieval eras. And the last point will be after the 18th century went on, the availability of composers grew more and more, which drove the amount of financial resources needed to get a composer down and down. So what this means is that before it used to cost a lot of money for groups to get a composer to make music for them, but now since more and more people began to get into music, more people began to start write music. So that drove the price lower and the availability of people grew higher. Now as a class we're going to be able to go over the where of the classical era. As the history of music began to grow longer and longer, Western music began to grow more and more popular. Austria was seen as the epicenter of the classical era, specifically Muscovarian Concert Hall. The city of Vienna served as the epicenter for the development and performances of music in the classical era. As the classical era grew more in popularity, it has shown that the regions of Asia began to pick up and practice this new style of music, specifically Japan. America has also shown that a great amount of love of music has been seen for the classical era. There are a large amount of symphony orchestras that are present and is seen as professional around the world. So as music began to spread around the world, specifically Western, more and more countries started to pick up on this style of music. So Japan and America. Vienna is seen as the epicenter because that's where a lot of the composers were from, and that's where a lot of the music in the classical era was being played, specifically Muscovarian Hall. Now we're going to go over the who of the classical era. There were many composers alive during the classical era that made impacts on music itself, but there are two that stick out from the rest, those being Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Ludwig van Beethoven. Here are some facts about Mozart. Mozart was born on January 27, 1756, and died on December 5, 1791, a relatively short life. Other than Mozart's composition techniques, he was most famous for learning how to play the piano by the age of 3. Mozart was actually able to write music before he was able to write words. Mozart composed half of the symphonies he would create in his lifetime from age 8 to 19. During Mozart's lifetime, he composed over 600 works, his most famous works being 22 operas, 18 masses, 5 violin concertos, 27 concert arias, 41 symphonies, 27 piano concertos, and 23 string quartets. Here's some facts about Beethoven. Beethoven was born on December 16, 1770, well after Mozart, and died on March 26, 1827. So you could see that during this time period there was some relatively short lifespans. Other than being one of the greatest composers of all time, he was mostly famous for his ability to compose music even though he was deaf. The way he would compose music was that he would put his ear on the floor next to the piano and use those vibrations to compose the music, which is pretty amazing when you ask me. Beethoven was most famous for his 9 symphonies, but he also wrote many other kinds of works such as chamber and choral music, piano music, string quartets, and an opera. Beethoven was sought out by his parents to be a piano prodigy just like Mozart, but he failed. He withdrew from school at the age of 10 in order to study music full time. So here's some fun facts. Beethoven had his first concert by the age of 7. Both of the composers had family that were involved in music. Mozart was extremely short. It was reported that Mozart measured at about 5 feet 4 inches. Beethoven was terrible at math, and Mozart hated the trumpet.
We will be talking about the instrumentation of the typical classical era orchestra. So, classical era orchestra had 3 sections of instruments. They had the string section, which consisted of violins, violas, cellos, and double bass. Then we have the woodwind section, which is typically smaller than the string section. For the woodwinds, we have 2 flutes, typically, 2 clarinets, 2 oboes, 2 bassoons. Then French horns and trumpets usually depends on what piece they are playing. And then finally, we have the percussion section. These guys usually, that's timpani, snare drum, bass drum, and then what other additional instruments they may need for the piece. Currently, this is very similar to the current day classical orchestra setup, in that this is very much still the same instrumentation for a lot of the pieces we still play today. The musical style of the classical period is very different than the musical style of the current period, the modern era that we are in. The characteristics are very different in depending on what era of music you are listening to. So while we're listening to Mozart's Symphony No. 4, the first movement, I want you to think about these 4 questions. Try to describe this music or answer these questions in your own words, the easiest way you can do. Okay? Here we have the musical characteristics of the classical period. We have an emphasis on elegance and balance. We have short, well-balanced melodies and clear-cut question and answer phrases. So they're very short, they're very clear when they start and when they end. Now we have simple diatonic harmonies. Diatonic are notes that belong in the key. We have mainly homophonic textures. Homophonic means 2. There's the main texture, and then there's accompaniment. And then we have contrasting moods. So they use a lot of moods like happy and sad. Finally, we have the art style of the classical period. We're going to be viewing a few of these paintings, and while we're viewing these paintings, I want you guys to think of these 4 questions. Similar to last time, think about them and trying to answer them the best you can in your own words. Okay? So, as we're viewing these, think of these questions. So classical art is known for its harmony, its balance, and its sense of proportion. When we're looking at these pieces of art, we can look that all of it looks very real life. All the paintings, all the people, all the animals, everything looks like it would be in real life. There's no crazy shapes. Everyone looks like a well-balanced person in that their physical body is proportional. And they try to do that with everything. Everything is trying to be proportional and even. And that's its harmony, it's balance. Even with expression in their face, it's very bland because they want everything in the painting to be balanced.